Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Fred Murphy with the Marxist Education Project, and we're very happy to welcome you all to an event with Paul Reitter, the translator of the new edition of Marx's Capital, Volume 1, published by Princeton University Press, and Michael Heinrich, who is, many of you may not need an introduction to Michael. He's a very well-known and long-standing scholar and activist in the field of Marx and Marxian studies. And capital in particular. And we're going to have just a couple of presentations by Paul and Michael. I might add that Paul North was originally expected to join us today. He had some last-minute family obligations that are keeping him away from. So we're very happy to have Paul Reitter here and Paul and Michael Heinrich for this event. Each of them are going to give a presentation for about 15 or 20 minutes from their particular angles on this project. And then we will, I think I'll have probably some comments and questions for them and provoke a little conversation between the two. And then we'll throw it open to you for questions and comments and discussion. So let me again introduce Paul, who is... Excuse me, I'm trying to find my notes here. Okay, here we go. Sorry. Yes. Paul Reitter. He's professor of Germanic languages and literature at The Ohio State University. His scholarship is focused on German Jewish culture and the history of higher education. He's the author of works on Karl Kraus, on the origins of Jewish self-hatred, and interesting title, Bambi's Jewish Roots, Essays on German Jewish Culture. Michael Heinrich had served on the editorial board for this new edition of Capital. He taught economics in Berlin and was managing editor of Prokla, a journal for critical social science. He's the author of quite a number of books on Marx and Capital, including an introduction to the 3 volumes, a multi-volume biography that he's currently working on, and the first volume has been published in English as Karl Marx and the Birth of Modern Society. Also the author of The Science of Value, Marx's Critique of Political Economy. So let's start with Paul Reitter. Excuse me, Paul. Take it away.
It's okay. I'm honored to be called Paul North, and I'm really sad that he can't be here today. Fred, thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to talk about the translation today. It's great to be here, and it's an honor also to share the stage with Michael. From the 2 bios, you can gather who has much deeper expertise in Marx, and so I'll try to get through my presentation pretty quickly, so we have all the more time for Michael. I'm going to talk about a couple of translation challenges and then a couple of ways in which I think my translation is different from the existing translations, different in ways that matter. And I can't see all the people who are here. It's nice that there's a big crowd, but I'll look out for the chat. And if you have a question while I'm talking and you want to put it in the chat, I'll try to keep track of that. I have some experience with Zoom teaching, mixed, but I'm not a total newcomer to this. So there are a lot of challenges, of course, in translating Marx, and I talk about some of them in the translator's preface to the edition. I'm going to try to talk mostly about things that I don't get into there because it's not so much fun to repeat yourself, and also, you can have access to that pretty easily. I think you can find a PDF of the translation on the web somewhere. And then, of course, if you want to, you can buy the translation, which, I'm not going to say don't do that. I'm also not going to try to sell it here either. So one significant challenge in translating Marx has to do with the mobility of Marx's prose. He constantly changes registers, going from technical discussions to furious lamentations to sarcastic moments to interesting mimetic moments where he's telling you what the worker sounds like, what the capitalist sounds like, what the commodity would sound like if it could speak. And this is a challenge when you're going from German to English in this kind of context for a number of reasons. One of them being that German to English translations, philosophical translations, they tend to get heavier in English, and they tend to sound a bit more technical in English. The classic example of this is Freud, where I imagine that some of you know that in the German, these terms that in English, ego, superego, id, parapraxis, that sound kind of technical, they're just everyday terms in German. And why this happens, why there's this kind of movement from German to English translation, that's an interesting topic that we can talk about if someone is interested in. But for the moment, trust me when I say that it happens. And it creates complications where there is this mobility, because if you have a passage that's already technical, and then it becomes more technical, because that's the way things tend to work when you're moving from German to English, then instead of a refreshing turn from the technical to the sarcastic or irreverent or colloquial or whatever, you get something that sounds like a crazy stylistic lurch, and it's not effective at all. And so one big challenge was to try to prevent that movement from happening, to preserve the movement in Marx's text, to prevent the text from becoming heavier, more technical in the English translation than in the German. And I have different strategies for that. And if you're interested, we can discuss them. But I'm going to move on now to the second challenge that I wanted to talk about. I mean, there are so many that can be discussed, but one has to, of course, choose in these situations. So this is a challenge that I do get into a bit in the translator's preface, and this has to do with German being, in comparison to English, a somewhat personifying language. In German, it's very customary to use reflexive verbs with inanimate objects. The question raises itself, and so on. And so if you're translating very directly from German to English, your English is going to sound weirdly personifying with questions raising themselves. And in a text, in a text like Capital, where there is a lot of very important programmatic personification, because Marx is making arguments about how dead things rule over living things, and that's one of the ways in which capitalism is oppressive and horrible, then it's very important to make these moments of programmatic personification legible as such. And if you're translating too directly, these moments are going to sound just like more personification or more moments of foreignizing translation, direct foreignizing translation in a generally foreignizing translation. So foreignizing translating in a generally foreignizing translation. So you're not necessarily going to think, okay, Marx is doing something programmatic here with agency, with ascribing agency to a non-living thing. You're going to think, well, this is just how this text sounds. And so I tried to be very careful in doing that, and also I tried to steer the translation a little bit in the direction of natural language so as to build up some trust with the reader, so that when you get a moment that sounds kind of strange because capital is doing something that you would expect a person to do, and by the way, my translation, in contrast to the others, always renders capital as capital. The others sometimes render it as capitalist. So I'm trying to keep this sense of upside down agency where I think it's very important. And one way of doing that is to be very careful about translating too directly elsewhere, and also to build up some trust with the reader by steering the prose in the direction of natural prose, so that when the reader reads one of these moments where, again, say capital is doing something that you would expect a person to do, the reader is not going to say, oh, this is just a translation-y moment. The reader is going to think, okay, this is a pretty, this is a translator who has shown himself to be capable of translating Marx into pretty natural English. And so if he's not doing it here, maybe he has a reason for not doing it. I do think that people read translations differently, and so that was a strategy for doing that. There are gray areas where there's some element of personification, and then you have to decide, do you want more or less? In the Fowkes translation, commodities are always confronting one another, and that to me sounds like very strong personification. The word confront is a pretty, intense word in English, and I do think that Marx is talking about the social relationships among commodities, and this is part of his personifying scheme, but that he's not being so aggressively personifying in this case, where he's talking about commodities facing each other in an exchange relation. And so I pull back. I don't use confronting. I use softer words like facing or interacting or something like that. So those are two of the many translation challenges that I faced. And again, I'm happy to talk more about these in the discussion. But I'm going to move on now to some differences between my translation and the other translations. And one difference, and I do talk about this as well in the preface, but I think it's a very important difference, so I'm going to bring it up again here, has to do with the language around value, Marx's central concept. And for different reasons, in both of the two major English translations, previous English translations, there are actually three, but there are only two that are in print and that people read and talk about, and those are the original, more Aveling translation done under Engels's supervision, published in 1886-87, and the Ben Fowkes translation, that's the Penguin translation, that appeared roughly 100 years later in 1976, which is probably the one that's most widely read today. And for very different reasons, they don't put a lot of themselves, these translators, into rendering this language that Marx creates to convey and analyze value, this concept that's so important to him. And it's an area where he feels that he's really made some very significant discoveries. And this is why he has to create new terms, neologisms, because these things haven't really been analyzed effectively before. And so he's creating new terms to talk about, well, not new things exactly, but things that haven't been, again, previously named. And so in the previous translations, this aspect of it, the neologizing character of his language, just basically gets lost. And so you don't have the sense that Marx is trying to invent the language here, which I think is very important. It conveys something about what he's trying to do. The originality of it, the creativity of it. And then in addition to that, of course, these are analytic terms that align with certain aspects of value. He was very careful about choosing his terms. And when you get rid of these terms, it becomes harder, I believe, to follow this difficult argument about value, about what it is and how it's expressed. That's such an important part of chapter 1, because he's using value to explain some very basic aspects of how the capital system essentially works. So one example is the term Wertding, which in German is a compound noun, value, Wert, and Ding, thing, two words that are cognate, that have cognates, obvious cognates in English. And Fowkes translates this term in different ways, sometimes as objective value, which is a problem for different reasons, and sometimes as a thing possessing value. which I think is not a very effective translation. Again, not only does the neologism get lost, but a thing possessing value, well, that's basically a definition of a commodity. A commodity is a thing possessing value. But Marx is making a very different point here in this particular case where it's translated in Fowkes as thing possessing value. I translate it just following the German quite closely as value thing. And Marx's point is that, and again, here he's trying to evoke, among other things, the uncanniness of capitalism, how in this capital system there's a great deal of doubling and things are one thing and the opposite of that thing. A commodity is a physical thing. It doesn't have to be a physical thing, but in Marx's examples, it's mostly a physical thing. It's a physical thing, a use thing, and the opposite of a physical thing, a value thing, a non-physical thing. That's basically just a hunk of objectified, abstract human labor that needs to be borne by a physical thing, but is not the physical thing. And when you present it as a thing possessing value, thing is a thing possessing value, that doubleness, the weirdness, essential weirdness of capitalism, it just gets lost. The argument becomes significantly harder to follow, I think. And then there are some places where it's just kind of misleading, where if you're not translating these terms carefully, you might wind up suggesting that Marx is talking about a physical thing when he's talking about a value thing, and that happens in the existing translations or the previous translations. I would say that above all, I would like this translation to be thought of as a thoughtful translation, and I like to think that in some ways, and I'm certainly not looking to suggest that the previous translations are not, good translations, but I do think that in some ways my translation is maybe a bit more thoughtful, more enabling. We're translating under difficult circumstances. Fowkes, I'm not as familiar with the circumstances of his translation, but he clearly has some priorities that he's putting more energy into than others. And there are areas where, again, I think that the translation is a little bit, or to go a little further here, I think the translation is a little bit lacking in what you could call thoughtfulness. And it sometimes has significant consequences. So some of these neologisms are big, striking words. Wertgegenständlichkeit, for example, which was not as easy to translate as Wertding, because Gegenständlichkeit, unlike value and thing, doesn't have a good match in English. I wound up translating it as objecthood. But then there are a lot of little words that are hard to translate. If you talk to German to English translators, they will tell you, don't think so much about the big words that German is famous for. It's the little words that often get you. German is, compared to English, a particle-happy language, where you're using small words for emphasis or for purposes of rhythm and cadence. And Marx was definitely very concerned about rhythm and cadence, a rhythm writer. And it presents you with a lot of challenges or tough choices there, because with some of these words that can function as particles, they can also function as adverbs, as adversatives. So, for example, the word aber, but, mostly means but, has an adversative sense often in German, but sometimes it's just used as a particle. And so if you translate it as but when it's just functioning as a particle, then you're going to introduce a meaning into the text that may actually kind of flip around the meaning that the author likely meant to convey. And I think that if you look carefully at how Fowkes handles these words, you'll see that sometimes he doesn't make such thoughtful choices. I'll give you an example. There's a footnote having to do with Protestantism and capitalism, an important topic. And the footnote says, generally speaking, that by converting all holidays into work days, Protestantism played an important role in the genesis of capitalism. So, given what's been said about Marx's deterministic view of history and how he reduces religion to an epiphenomenon. It's interesting that he's talking about religion now driving capitalism forward. The way I translated the term, the way I translated the footnote, I think is actually insufficient. That's how Fawkes translates it, and he winds up with that by dropping the word schon, which can function as an adverb, can mean already, can also be a kind of strengthening particle, something used for emphasis or something used for rhythm. And it occurs in the German sentence. So Moore Aveling dropped it, Fawkes dropped it. But if you think carefully about what Marx would be conveying in this sentence, I mean, would he really be likely to point out that Protestantism, that this is all it does in the way of influencing capitalism, driving the advance of capitalism. And in fact, the way that schon is placed in there's placement matters here a lot too. The way that it is placed in the sentence strongly suggests, I think, that here it has the meaning of, and this is one of its meanings, of already by doing this, so it kind of picks up on the already meaning, but has a little bit of a different sense. Already by doing this, and not only by doing this, just starting with this. So in my translation, I forget exactly what I say, the sentence reads something like, by converting all holidays into work days, and not only by doing that, Protestantism played an important role in the genesis of capitalism. Marx is pointing to a whole nother field of influence. And again, given the importance of this debate about Marx and religion and historical causality, I think that's a very important point. It all turns on how you translate, if you translate, this little word schon. And then final thing here, and then I'll turn it over to Michael. The Moore Aveling translation, you could say, moves in two different directions at once. I think that as a first translation, it felt a lot of pressure not to present readers most of whom weren't necessarily going to be familiar with Marx. Marx was not super famous in 1887, and they weren't motivated in the way that you are when you're reading a classic. So it's very concerned, I think, with how strange the text seems. And as I mentioned, strangeness, to evoke the strangeness of capitalism, well, that's a big part of what Marx is trying to do, and he creates a language that does that. But that also, from the perspective of a first translator, makes things difficult. And the Moore Aveling translation pulls back pretty clearly on this strangeness, so that some of these neologisms, like Wertgegenständlichkeit, a strange word in German, just becomes value at one point, or reality at one point, very everyday words. So that's one way, then, they make the text a little bit less strange. Another way they make the text a little bit less strange is by doing something that, well, is very different. And it is more like what the Freud translation does when it translates, what the authorized Strachey Freud translation does when it translates it as id. It translates everyday terms as elevated terms. The Moore Aveling translation does this quite a bit. And so it sometimes translates Marx's strange terms as everyday terms, and sometimes it translates Marx's everyday terms as elevated terms. And you could say that that is making the text less natural, because we associate often, or we think of natural language as kind of conversational language, not formal or technical language. But in the context of scholarly writing, and Capital is always emphasizing how scholarly it is, how wissenschaftlich it is, natural language, colloquial language, conversational language, this actually can sound kind of strange and unusual. And paradoxically, then, it becomes more natural sounding when you introduce elevated terms, the kind of terms that you would expect in this context, which I think is what Moore Aveling were thinking when they translated everyday terms like Hülle, which means shell or husk, as integument, a term that comes from entomology and that nobody knows. And that, I mean, you know it if you look it up, but most readers aren't going to know it, straight off just by looking at it. And that has the effect then of diluting the directness, the forcefulness of Marx's prose, which, by which he is making a political statement. It's, at times this book has a real, like, grab you by the collar directness. He wants to speak to you. That matters to him. And he's not trying to sound like a Mandarin. I mean, he has all these fancy literary references, but there's another side to it as well. And Fawkes, even though he complains about more Aveling in his preface, and treats them rather dismissively, he follows them a lot. In fact, he retains integument, not, I think, because, it's established itself as a technical concept, just because, he follows them a lot. This happens in retranslation. There's a lot of borrowing. And my translation, I like to think, preserves the energy, the vigor, the directness of the German considerably more than the other translations do, and it makes for, I think, a significantly more readable text. Okay, that's what I have. Thank you for listening. Michael, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. First, thank you to Fred to organize this event and to invite us. And also now thank to you, Paul, to start with this nice considerations where you minimize a little bit your role as a translator at the beginning. I will come at the end of my short presentation back to this. What I want to do now is just to give a little bit of framework discussing capital and why it is important now to have a new translation and a new translation of a new text. But I will start with some general remarks, and then I will come to the more concrete points. The first point we have always to remember when we discuss about Marx Capital is that the 3 volumes of Capital form a unity. When we read only volume 1, it is not only incomplete, it is somehow misleading, or there is a big danger of being misleading. That you see in value the center of price oscillations, but in volume 3 you will learn it is not value, it is the production price. You will confuse surplus value with profit, and perhaps more subtle when you only read volume 1, where after the first 3 chapters about commodity circulation, Marx is mainly dealing with the production process. You can have the idea that in this analysis of the production process, you will find all the essential information. But Marx always aims to present the unity of production and circulation, and so this first volume is only the first step in order to present this unity of production and circulation. My second general remark, maybe it's also not so surprising, is to stress the unfinished character of capital. That capital is an unfinished work is not a very surprising message. But the question is, in which respect is capital unfinished? One aspect is very clear. It is unfinished in a quantitatively sense. For example, the last chapter of volume 3 stops, this last chapter about classes, stops after 1.5 pages. Marx just didn't finish. But with such a quantitatively unfinished text, you could imagine, yes, Marx was ready with his analysis, he solved all the problems, but he didn't manage to write down what he found in a nice way. He didn't manage to do this completely. And there are enough places in Capital where you can say this. However, I think Capital is also unfinished in a qualitatively sense that certain problems are not solved. And Marx himself knows this and points to this. For example, in volume 3, the section on credit is unfinished, not only in this quantitative sense, but also in a qualitative sense. Marx has problems with the levels of abstraction, what has to present it, what has to present it not, and so on. Also, we can find different approaches to crisis theory in different manuscripts. And from his letters, we know that Marx realized that in the 1870s, a new form of crisis appeared, and this put some problems in the analysis of this new form of crisis. And also, the very often disputed question of the law of the tendency of the profit rate to fall. I think there are some hints that Marx changed his position in the 1870s, but this is not part in the manuscripts for volume 3. So we have unfinished work in several levels. And when Capital, the 3 volumes of Capital, really is a unity, then this means the unfinished character of volume 2 and 3, or the unfinished discussing of certain problems in volume 2 and 3 also has consequences for volume 2. It would be an illusion to say, yes, volume for volume 1, consequences for volume 1. I think it would be an illusion to say volume 1, Marx published, the work is done, everything is clear, problems we are only facing with volume 2 and 3. No, the unity means that changes in volume 2 and 3 have an effect also of volume 1. And Marx himself, in a letter to Danielson, written in December 1881, even give some hints that he wanted to change volume 1 rather strongly. He wrote, "Now I'm in a bad I'm in a bad condition." His wife just died. He was sick also himself, and he said, the publisher asked me to do changes for the 3rd edition. I will ask the publisher to print only a small number of copies with minimal additions, and then when I'm fit for the 4th edition, I will do much more fundamental changes to this volume. We don't know exactly what he wants to change. There are certain hints. I would say, for example, he wanted to change the section on the so-called primitive accumulation, or better translation, original accumulation. At least in the 1870s, Marx studied a lot of historical literature which makes sense. He studied about the development of cities, for example, in the last medieval time. It would make sense if he had the plan to present this original accumulation not only with the example of England, but what he already gave hints in his letters, to present it that there were different ways in which capitalism emerged. It is not only this one classical way in England. So it would make sense to put, when I read the letters, when I read the excerpts, for me it makes sense that, for example, he wants to rework this chapters on original accumulation. There are also hints for other points, but my main point is here, the conclusion I do from this reworking plans, that with the 3 volumes of Capital as we know them, we have not a finished work. We have steps on the road to reach such a finished work, but these steps express insights on rather different levels. So we have to treat the 3 volumes of Capital as a unity, but we have also always to be very cautious at which state, at which level we receive here this unity. And then the fourth remark of these general remarks, what we should have in mind, at least until now, until this new translation. The 3 volumes of Capital we can usually find in bookstores nowadays. Marx never saw them. They are from Marx, but Marx never saw these 3 volumes. For volume 2 and 3, the case is clear. Engels edited this volume 2 and 3 from manuscripts Marx left when he died. Engels didn't publish the original papers. He strongly edited them. Some manuscripts he used, other manuscripts he didn't use. He changed sometimes the structure of the manuscripts. He's changed many formulations. He inserted divisions in chapters and subchapters, and also he inserted chapter titles or titles also of subchapters. And by these titles, he structured also the expectation of the reader. What can I expect from this chapter or subchapter? Usually is strongly influenced by the title of the chapter or subchapter, and especially in volume 3, most of the titles are from Engels and not from Marx. Engels had no other chance than to do this. I don't want to criticize Engels. Engels wanted to present a popular version and not a scientific critical edition, and so he had to intervene. But nowadays, when we read these texts, we should be clear that we have not original Marx texts. We have texts originally coming from Marx, but which are strongly edited. A little bit surprisingly, this counts also for volume 1 of Capital, at least in the most widespread version, the 4th edition from 1890. An edition done by Engels. What did Engels do in this edition, and already in the 3rd edition from 1883, which Engels provided shortly after Marx's death. Marx had published the second German edition, 1872-73, and then a French translation was prepared. Marx corrected this translation. He changed also the German text. The translator didn't exactly translate the second German edition. What he translated is somehow a mixture between the first and second edition. Marx intervened. He changed not only the translation, he changed also the text, so it is a version by its own. Sometimes it is a little bit overrated. Marx wrote in the French preface, or in the letter to the French publisher, that this French edition has a value by itself. Even when you are able to speak German, you should use this French edition. However, when Danielson wanted to translate in Russian, Marx strongly informed him, gave him the hint, don't use the first two sections for the Russian translation, meaning the section on commodity and the section on transformation of money in capital. For this, use the German edition. So the French edition in some aspects is better, more advanced than the second German, but in some aspects it is less advanced. And what did Engels, after the death of Marx, he tried to produce a kind of unified edition, a kind of merging of the second German edition and of the French edition. Also Marx planned this, but there is no schedule for this. So Engels integrated some parts of the French translation, but not all the parts. And also he did a number of insertions. Some of the insertions, Engels, to this Engels put his initials, but there are also a number of insertions of Engels without his initials. And so for the reader, it is not clear that this is an insertion of Engels. The result, this fourth edition, what also is the text used for the Penguin edition in the translation of Ben Fowkes, is a kind of mixture of two different texts of Marx plus insertions of Engels. Now, with this new translation, you have not again a new translation of the fourth edition of Capital from 1890. No, you have a translation of the second German edition from 1872-73, and as far as I know, it is the first English translation of this second German edition. And in the appendix, you have a translation from certain important paragraphs of the French translation from French in English. And also this, I think, is the first time that this happens. So what Engels mixed together in a certain way, you can, maybe you like it, maybe you dislike it. Now it is again separated, and you can understand what was Marx doing in the second German edition and at least in the parts which are translated, what he was doing in the French translation. And when you have in mind that Capital, the 3 volumes, is not a finished project, but a project where all the parts depend on each other, then it is very important and a big progress that now you have these original texts of Marx really in front of you, and you need not only to use the mixture which Engels prepared in 1890. And so far, for a scientific treatment of Capital, I think it is a big progress that now these new texts, new for the English reader, are translated finally. And now, just to come to say a few words also to the translation. Of course, I'm not a native speaker in English, and when you hear me, you understand that I communicate in broken English with you. But in the past, I also had to occupy with the English translations of Capital. Perhaps you know that I wrote not only this introduction to the 3 volumes, but also a commentary to the first chapters of volume 1, where I tried to treat meticulously the first chapters, the formulation. There's a commentary to nearly each paragraph of these chapters. And very often I was very unhappy with the translation in the Penguin edition, because I stressed certain points, but these points were not present in this Penguin translation. Sometimes Marx used the same term in different places, but in the English translation it was translated very differently, and the English reader had no idea that Marx was using the same term, and sometimes a term Marx himself coined. So it had a very special meaning. Sometimes the structure of the sentence didn't really express what was expressed in German and what in my commentary I relate to. So I have some experience with this English translation, the old English translation, and with Paul Reitter I had discussions. I don't know when they started. I think in 2018 or 19. It was definitely before the COVID epidemic started. And so I have very many translations, and I can really confirm his judgment. It is a thoughtful translation, and so I think that it's a new text with a new, much more careful and meticulous translation than we saw in the past, so that this really will show a big progress for discussing Capital in the Anglophone world. So these were my remarks. Thanks for your attention, and I think now we can come to the discussion.
All right, thanks, Michael and Paul. I wonder if either of you have questions or comments on each other's presentation, that we might start there. If you have any, if you'd like to have a little conversation about some of these topics between yourselves.
Okay, Fred, my last remark was already a small commentary to Paul. that I confirm his judgment, and we discussed also a lot about the problems he mentioned. So I only can confirm it, but not really comment it. But maybe perhaps Paul has a comment on mine.
Uh, well, in the first place, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Mikhail for all his support and help with the translation. It was really incredibly generous of him to give as much time as he did to discussing translation issues. I know he always said that he was learning from this too, and it was edifying for him. But he was working at the time, as he is now, on his big biography project, and I always felt a little guilty about claiming his time for the translation. These big projects, they really they make people incredibly selfish, and your whole sense of decorum goes out the window, and you just keep asking and asking and asking for support. And Michael was amazingly friendly and generous, and of course, in the best resource you could imagine for talking through questions about how to render some of these terms around value. He's been studying this for decades and is the foremost expert on it, really. And so it was fantastic to have that. I thank him in the book, but I want to keep thanking him. He's also been very generous in talking about the book and the translation, and playing up its merits and not mentioning its defects. And so thank you for that too, Mikhail. And his emphasis on the unfinished character of the work, which you heard him talk about, it definitely played a role in in the translation. I tried while translating, and I've been thinking about this quite a bit lately. I tried not to have big interpretations of capital in my head so much. When you translate a book like this, people will ask you, so how do you understand it differently now? And my understanding of the book has changed in various ways because of the experience of translating it. But while translation, of course, centrally involves interpretation, it's also important not to read as a translator in the way that you're reading when you're doing literary criticism, and I do that too, or you're reading for the purpose of making some big argument about a text. And I think it's actually quite rare that a translator turns around after doing a translation and then writes some bold, against the grain interpretation of an important text, because you are trying to honor every line. And it's not like you're trying to get inside the author's head exactly, but you're definitely not trying to read between the lines and go against the grain in the way that you are when you're making an argument as a scholar. And so you're reading carefully, but you're also at times, in this context, reading badly, pushing aside the things that don't fit your argument so well. And however, there were some ideas about capital that were inspiring for me as I worked on this, coming from scholars, people who have made big claims about the book. And Mikhail is a very interesting person in this regard because he's made big claims about the book, controversial claims that have led to a lot of debate, but he also has done, as has been mentioned, a lot of commentary, which is reading very much like a translator, where you're going through line by line, you're not skipping anything, you're trying to say what this means on the author's terms, first and foremost. And his emphasis on the unfinished character of the work, that definitely helped guide me as I was thinking about what things mattered, what things were very important to preserve. You can't prioritize everything, even as you're trying to honor every line as much as you can. And so that was what what he mentioned throughout his presentation, the unfinished character of the work, something that he has emphasized perhaps more than anyone, this played an important role in my translation. I see there's a hand up.
Why don't we go to the hands that are up? We have Sasha and we have Steve Backman on Stack from the chat. So go ahead, Sasha.
Thank you. And thank you for organizing the event. That's helpful to me, at least. Hello, Michael, by the way. I wanted to ask whether there's also some kind of interpretation in the background of translating the work. Of course, you have an opinion on the interpretation of capital, and I would see the danger that, or not the danger, but like it has an impact on how you translate it. So I wanted to ask you whether you think, or in which way it had impact on the translation process. And also, Michael mentioned, which was a convincing example, that there was a term which Marx actually described or invented, and Fox didn't really consider that. But still, I would think your meticulous work on Capital and chapter 1 until 3, or the beginning of Capital, your book about that, still sometimes has also your interpretation in it, I would say. And would you say that this is also the case when you were discussing it with Paul for the translation? Thank you.
Paul, do you want to start or?
Sure. So, picking up on what I was just saying about the unfinished character of the work and putting a certain emphasis on that, seeing it as something important, not something that's incidental. Well, it's, a little bit unfinished. That not everyone agrees with that. There was a time when Capital was most of the time presented as a work that was in fact completely finished, and it was a closed system. This is the way Isaiah Berlin and Joseph Schumpeter talked about it. And so to say then that it's unfinished, that's not exactly, and I think Michael suggested this, it's not exactly a statement of fact. It is an interpretation, and how would that interpretation then guide translation decisions? Well, for me, one reason to preserve these neologisms is because I think they help to they correspond to this unfinished character, to this in-progress character. Marx, he was constantly revising these neologisms too, and one of the things they do is they suggest that and sometimes there are some interesting shifts between the different figures that Marx uses in his attempts to evoke and analyze value. When you lose these things, when you lose the neologisms, another thing you lose, again, is part of this sense of the work being in progress, Marx exploring, inventing new terms, moving in the direction of a better presentation of this. And if you don't really think of the work as being unfinished, or you think that it's minimally unfinished, then you have less motivation to do that, to preserve the neologisms, and that may be one reason why they didn't get preserved, or another reason why they didn't get preserved in the previous translations. Then there are a lot of debates about value and how Marx understands value, and the way in which value exactly is a social substance, and that can affect translating decisions too. It did, in fact. So, for example, where Marx basically defines value for the first time in Capital, in the first pages of Capital, there's a sentence where he says that labor products as crystallized pieces of this social substance, which is, and the German is ihnen gemeinschaftlich, they are values. So that ihnen gemeinschaftlich previously had been translated as common to them all. So as this pieces, crystallized pieces, or in the other translations, it's just as crystals of this social substance, which is common to them all. The labor products are values. And if you're not that interested in exactly how value works as a social substance, then maybe you'll content yourself with that translation, even though, as the other translators did, even though it has the problem of being an obvious tautology, right? If labor products are, as values, crystallized pieces of this social substance, abstract, objectified human labor, then of course it's common to them all. It has to be common to them all, right? That's a tautology. And it's only if you're curious about how value really does work as a social substance and really, looking to explore that maybe you'll push on and try to come up with a different, maybe better translation, because the German here is a little bit cryptic, ihnen gemeinschaftlich. Another challenge of translating Marx, which I talk about in the translator's preface quite a bit, is that he really, as a writer, prized compression. This is another area where what you hear about German doesn't necessarily correspond to the reality of what German to English translators deal with. So German is thought of as this language with very long sentences. Things get stretched out and distended. And yes, that's true. And there are very long sentences in capital that broke up or rearranged, and that was a challenge. But a greater challenge, a more frequent challenge, was trying to preserve Marx's compression. Text and translation tend to get longer for various reasons. You're sometimes providing a little context that the original readers would have, but the translation audience, of course, a different audience, a new audience. That's, by nature what happens with the translation, that the audience changes with the language. Doesn't have the same context, so you add in words for that reason. But with German to English, German, because of inflected case endings, gendered nouns, there are a lot of resources in German that allow you to compress, to leave out words where in English you have to repeat a word, or you can't just keep saying it, because it isn't marked by gender and case in the way that it is in German. And so you feel frustrated because the English is getting longer. I haven't done a word count, my translation versus Marx's German, but I assume that it's a longer text. So Marx really likes compression. That's a big challenge in translating capital. And here he's being very compressed. Ihnen gemeinschaftlich, that's what he says about these crystals of the social substance. And here is a place where I really relied on Michael's commentary pretty heavily, and I translated this then as crystallized pieces of the social substance that they consist of collectively. That's what it seems to me Marx is getting at here, that they cannot be pieces of this social substance on their own. They can only be that. They can only be values, in other words, as a group. And that has implications for the question of where value comes into being, which is a live issue in debates about capital. And so that would be another area where the interpretation affects the translation. I spoke for a lot longer than I wanted to. I apologize. Michael, please.
Yeah, I tried to make it a little bit shorter. It was a very good question by Sasha, the influence of interpretation to translation and to commentary. I suppose Sasha's answer would be interpretation always has a strong influence on translation and on commentaries. And I would go even a step further. Whenever we discuss about capital, no matter who is discussing, we confront different interpretations. There are only different interpretations of capital. There is nowhere the pure capital. There are some persons who think their own interpretation is so convincing, this is the poor capital, but it's also only one translation of many. However, this doesn't mean that every interpretation has the same level, the same value. There are some interpretations you can just throw out. They are contradicting so much the textual evidence that you can say, okay, this is nonsense, this interpretation. But after throwing out this obviously nonsense interpretations, we still have different interpretations which make sense, which can rely on the text, but nevertheless they show big differences. Just because the one reader says this statement of Marx is very important, and the other interpreter says the other statement is so important. And already by this distinction starts a different kind of interpretation. Insofar, you can never escape the influence of your interpretation. What I tried to do in the commentary were to mark the places, to show the places in Marx texts where we can find very different interpretations. I briefly mentioned the other way of reading, and I just make clear to the reader what I present here will not be shared from everybody reading Capital. This is my understanding of the text. And of course, it can happen that my book is read by others now or in a few years, and they can find other places which I didn't pay attention or which I didn't realize, where they can say, oh, here we see clearly the influence of a strong interpretation of Michael. Now we have other interpretations. So the discussion which interpretation has which influence on a certain translation or on a certain on a certain commentary, this discussion, I think, will never stop. Each generation develops a new reading, and this new reading leads also to new judgments of old translations and old commentaries.
Okay, let's go to Steve Backman and then George.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this new book, which I look forward to reading myself and studying here at the MEP. And thank you both for your comments and answers so far. When I asked to speak, I didn't realize that I'm recasting what I was going to say in the light of Sasha's questions and your answer to it. And on this point about interpretation, I wonder also how much different interpretations and different readings of the book, the writing of it and the reading of it, is affected by the times, the present times. I mean, the 1870s, that was one context for the original English, and, you know, around that time, the other editions. 1970s, mid-1970s, a different context. What about the present context here and worldwide affected the writing of this book, and also, or both of your books, and the interpretations you give to it? And then another way of asking the same question is, why do we need to read Capital differently in 2024?
Mikhail, would you like to start?
Maybe I can start. Of course, I agree with what you said at the beginning, that also the interpretations are influenced by the times in which they are formulated. And especially regarding Marx, I see two rather different influences. On the one hand, there is an influence on the political situation, on class struggle, on the case of socialism. Before 1917, there was not a socialist revolution. Then we had a socialist revolution with a result which was questioned from the beginning. In the 90s, this result, the Soviet Union, break down. Also from this, you can have different conclusions. And of course, all these things influenced interpretations, but not in a deterministic way, because the same historical facts, like the breakdown of Soviet Union or the emergence of Soviet Union, you can also understand and interpret in rather different ways. So this counts, I think, for every interpretation of political philosophy, political theory, and so on. With Marx, we have a special additional moment that when Marx died, many texts which nowadays count as important texts were not published. The writings of the young Marx, the excerpts, the drafts for Capital, all this was published in 20th century, but not in one big effort. It was the publications lasted the whole 20th century, and even now at the beginning of 21st century, we are not finished with this process. So every generation knew a different Marx, in quotation marks, when I understand Marx as the sum of his works. The sum of his works in 1920 was different from 1950, and it was different from the year 2000. And this also is a context for interpretation. And this, I think, answers your last question. Why do we need in the year 2024 a new reading of Marx, or a new interpretation, or a new occupation with Capital? Because historical developments are never finished. We always are in a historical process, but also the process of the publication of Marx writings is not finished. And also, when something is published, it is a question in what is the quality of the publication. For example, the publication of the early writings of Marx, economic philosophical manuscripts or German ideology in the 1930s, is very different from the quality they are published now in the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, and the way they are edited influence the way we read it and we interpret this. And insofar, I think it is necessary in 2024 to read in a new way, discuss in a new way Capital. And I suppose when finally Mega is finished in maybe early 2030s, again it is necessary, because we have more texts of Marx.
I will just add Thank you for that answer, Mikhail. That translation is affected in various ways by the circumstances in which it takes place, and there is also, I think, a certain dynamic to retranslation itself, where as a retranslator, at times you are quite familiar with the existing translation. It depends on what you're translating. I think there's something like 60 English translations of Homer, and I don't imagine that new translators of Homer are familiar with all of these translations, but probably, almost certainly, they're familiar with some. Classics have a kind of ambient presence in the culture, and I would imagine that most people who, since people don't grow up reading ancient Greek, I would imagine that most translators of Homer into English and other languages first experience Homer in translation, and then they experience Homer in Greek, and probably when they have that experience in the Greek, after having experienced Homer in translation, they feel as though there's something in their experience of Homer in Greek that hasn't come across effectively in the translations. And that's what motivates them to retranslate. I can say that that was my experience. I was very familiar with the English translations of Capital before I started to translate Capital. And over the years, I developed kind of a list of things that I wanted to preserve that I felt hadn't been preserved so well. This is because I taught Capital in English for quite a while before I started translating Capital. And I didn't feel, why didn't I just translate it myself? I didn't feel quite prepared. This is not, a starter translation project. So I did some other translation projects. And then at a certain point, you never really feel ready to do this, but I felt readier. And so, it's not, I suppose, you could a matter simply of having new interpretations. It's also a matter of feeling as though you're reading the book in a way that makes certain things more important, and if those things haven't been prioritized by previous translators, then you have significant motivation to retranslate the book. And some of these things, what gets prioritized, it's a matter of interpretation. It's also a matter of what people are generally interested in at a particular moment, and that changes over time. So now, thanks in large part to Mikhail and his work, but not only Mikhail, people are very interested. I keep coming back to this, but it is very important. Are in the book, or from my experience of the book, people are very interested in understanding precisely how Marx's arguments about value work. That hasn't always been the case, it's, yes, there's I have a different interpretation, but it's also that these things just didn't matter so much to previous translators, and that changes over time, and that then gives you motivation to translate, and it gives the retranslations again this kind of conversational dynamic, which I like. I only ever retranslate. I'm not a translator of new material. I like the conversational dynamic of retranslation. It's familiar to me from scholarship. It's very much like what you have in scholarship, where if you're working, as I do, mostly on material that's been talked about quite a bit by previous scholars, you are coming to a text trying to add to a conversation. Retranslation is different, and in some ways, I suppose, more exciting, because the way you add to the new conversation is not by writing a new scholarly text about a primary text. It's by creating a new edition of the primary text, and that has a kind of thrilling immediacy to it.
Let's go to George.
Okay, thank you. First, let me thank Fred and Steve and David, who's here, and Lisa, for keeping the New York Marxist School and the Brecht Forum alive, and COVID as well. And Paul for resolving an argument I've had for 40 years now since the Fowlkes translation came out. I was excited, very excited, and I still am, when I opened up the book and I immediately went to your definition of a commodity. Because if I may, I'll be quick, but in that international publication, the one that I read and have gone, a commodity is in the first place an object outside us. A thing by its properties satisfies human wants of some sort or another. In the Fowlkes translation, I guess you know, it's needs. And I've been arguing for years. And so when I opened up your book and I saw, I quote this, and it's written better too, a commodity is first of all an external object, a thing whose properties satisfy human wants or needs of whatever kind. And I thought, thank you. So that's just in the first paragraph and the definition of commodity. And I can only imagine that it goes on like that throughout. And it's an enormous project. I think it's wonderful. And I see you're young enough, and I hope you go through volume 2 and especially volume 3. So thank you all.
Thank you, George. That was very nice to hear.
Let's go to Peter Fay. Hi, Peter. Good to see you.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, right. Yeah, nice to listen in on this. And I would second what George said. That's one of my pet peeves. And also, I guess we're a dying breed, those of us who cut our teeth on the international version rather than the Fowlkes version didn't exist when I first started reading this as a kid. So, that's what I came to understand capital as, the international version. But one, just kind of a parenthetical question, is not really significant, but I'm curious, first of all, the translation of corn being, you seem to translate it as wheat instead of corn, and having written a lot of stuff on British history, corn, of course, means grain, any number of grains, and I'm just curious what the choice of translating corn as wheat, because those Americans, may not be familiar. Corn in British English has a different meaning than in American English. And my second question is, are you actually going to translate volume 2 and 3, and how would that ever work? How could you figure out which original manuscript to actually translate? I'm curious about that as well. So that's 2 questions in one. Thanks.
Well, thanks for the questions. Yeah, you pressed on kind of a sore point there, wheat. I know we had a discussion about it, Paul and I can't quite remember how we settled on wheat, but perhaps you'll be pleased to hear that for the paperback edition, we're changing it to grain.
Great.
So I don't think that's not our best moment, wheat. And I don't want to put the blame on Paul because he's not here to defend himself, but maybe he pushed for wheat for some, he had some, because I can't think of an argument that I made for wheat. In any case, we're going to change that to grain, so I apologize for that. And then with the other editions, well, I've been having conversations with Michael about this, and we've been going back and forth a bit on how to proceed. One thing I haven't talked about today is the philological side of this project, the annotations and the challenges they involved, the challenge of how to present Marx's quotations, his translations of the source material from English into German for the body of the text are often not easy to reproduce. Our editorial principle was to try to get readers as close as we could to what's in the second German edition. And if you're going to do that, then it often doesn't make sense to just simply go to the source text that Marx is citing from and give what's there. Because in the citation, Marx sometimes reorders citations, changes the sentence order around, He's translating. Sometimes the translations are actually more like paraphrase than translations. The changes are that significant. Sometimes he does strange things where he'll like put in an ellipsis where it isn't in the source text, and these are in cases where he actually had the volume in his library, so it's not totally clear why he did that. In any case, there were a lot of decisions to make about what to do with these kinds of things, and we tried to make for readers as transparent as possible where we changed source material around to match what Marx had, which is something that the other translations don't do. Sometimes they match the citation to what Marx has. Sometimes they just give what's in the original, even though what Marx has is quite different, and they pretty much never tell you when they're matching and when they're not. And we tell you when we're making changes, significant changes to match what Marx has, but sometimes it's very difficult to do that. For example, there's a case where the English source text, the factory inspector's report, has the sentence, "The smell was almost unbearable." And if you were to back translate into English what Marx's translation has, it would be, "The smell was unbearable." So this almost that's in the English gets dropped. Well, is that a mistake? Possibly. Marx did make transcription errors. Is it an amplifying translation? Now the smell isn't almost unbearable, it's unbearable. Well, that's possible too. Marx sometimes did kind of put his finger on the scale a little bit in presenting evidence and try to make things out to be even worse than they sound in the factory inspector's reports. There are clear examples where that's the case. Or is Marx, as a sensitive and also creative translator, which he was, is he trying to match the German to the English, thinking that in this case the best thing to do is drop the almost because this is a kind of British understatement that doesn't translate well into German? Could be that too. And so there, it's hard to know what to do to best match the source to best match the source material to what Marx gives his readers. This is all working up to an answer to your question. The philological challenges for Volume 2, they would be quite different because Engels stitched together this finished text from 8 manuscripts written over 15 years. And what I have in mind to do is to translate the text that Engels presented. That's become an important work in its own right, but to make as transparent as possible for readers what he did as he proceeded. And he does give in places indications as to where he's using this manuscript or that manuscript, but to really follow the steps more closely and to note where they're important, which is not something that the German critical edition does so well. It almost gives you too much information. It tells you, what Engels is doing so much that the important moves aren't easy to identify there in these lists that they have. And so that's what I would like to do. And I would also like, at the same time, to let the style of the manuscripts shine through a little bit. It's very hard to translate stylistic liveliness or to reproduce it at exactly the level where you find it in the source text. In other words, the translation, as with ambiguity, translation tends to be a little more ambiguous or a little less ambiguous. It's a little more stylistically lively or it's a little less stylistically lively. You have to decide which way to go because it's very hard, again, to achieve the exact level that you have in the source text, as you understand the source text. You're obviously going on your experience of it. And because the manuscripts are often quite a bit livelier than the text that Engels presented in his attempt to make the text appear as a finished whole, he kind of flattened out the style a bit, which varies over these different manuscripts. And so in deciding which way to go there, up or down with the style, I'm going to let myself be guided by the the style of the manuscripts, which I think is very interesting. You know, there's this debate about the literary qualities of capital and the extent to which they're ornamentation, the extent to which they're more than that. And I think that one of the things that the manuscripts really shows you when you study them closely is that to a large extent, this is just how Marx thought in literary references, in jokes. This was very natural to him. And it's unfortunate that it doesn't always come across that way in the writings of his that have been presented to the public for various reasons. I know Michael has ideas about the best way to proceed here, and so I'll let him tell you what he thinks.
Okay, this is I'm not a translator, so I have some other ideas. But what I just had in mind when you mentioned you want to show in volume 2 what Engels did with the manuscripts in Mega, they show all the differences, but that in this much material, the important things Engels did are not so visible, that they are buried under a mountain of details. And I think exactly here, interpretation starts. It is not clear by itself what is an important step of Engels. And insofar, Mega is trying to give us the material to see all the things Engels did, and then it's our task to discuss what is an important step and what is a not so important step. And this sometimes is not so easy, and even Mega comes to its limits. In the manuscripts, Marx abbreviates the German article der, die, das. In English you have only the, but in German it is gendered. Der, male, die, female, das, God, what is the English term for neither male nor female? Neutral, I think, yeah. And Marx always abbreviates, or almost always, abbreviates just with a D. So you don't know what does he want, der or die or das. In most cases, it is clear from the context. When the article refers to a female noun, it has to be die. When it refers to a male noun, it has to be der. But sometimes this is not clear, and then it is already a case of interpretation what Engels inserted, because Engels, of course, doesn't let the abbreviation die. He inserts a whole article, and sometimes it can even change the sense of a sentence if you use the male or the female form, because then the article refers to a different noun, and this produces a different sense. And there are some cases I not only discussing with Paul, sometimes I'm also discussing with the translators of the Chinese translation for this big Chinese edition. And I remember one discussion we had about how to fill this abbreviation about die. Becomes it der or does it become das? It really made a difference, and this sometimes even in Mega is not clear. So I would say you can even improve, or you can increase the number of points Mega should show. And this then would make our task to find out what is really important, would it make more difficult?
Yeah. Um, if there is a clear case where the commentary is going to turn on interpretation, these claims about what to include and what not to include, uh, there you're making determinations based on a reading of the text. And this edition, like the edition of Volume 1, I would like to be a little bit of a middle thing between just an annotated edition and a critical edition. I like it to be broadly usable and not simply a specialized resource for scholars. And so that necessitates making choices and not having exhaustive lists of changes that Engels made. So, there are ways to finesse the situation. You can have online an online appendix where, well, space just works differently, and you can include things that aren't included in the physical edition of the book. That's a possibility, and maybe we'll do that. And I have to say, I mean, I'm right now I'm working on the paperback edition of Volume 1, and so Volume 2 is not so much on my mind at the moment, but that'll change pretty soon. And I did start working on it a bit over the summer, but I'm now, looking, going through Volume 1, doing things like changing wheat to grain, and I imagine that the editorial strategies for Volume 2 will change as we actually get into the work, and that tends to be the way that it happens.
Having just finished a study group on Volume 2 with a number of the comrades that are here today, I'm sure we will all welcome a livelier and more readable text of Volume 2, which we struggled through it, certain parts of it for sure. There's a question in the chat from Jack Jones, which I don't know if you comrades have seen. I'll just read or paraphrase. It says, having read the first part, which was outstanding, I know Michael is working on this several-part biography of Marx, and I wanted to ask, selfishly, how this project is progressing and how important this kind of biographical understanding of Marx's life is when it comes to understanding, interpreting, or translating Marx's work. Are there any concrete examples of times when this biographical work has enriched and developed your understanding of Marx?
Yeah, I see. It's impossible that I'm somewhere discussing without receiving a question about the Marx biography. I think this biographical work, and in German it has also the subtitle Biografie und Werkentwicklung, biography and evolution of the works, is rooted in the idea that the biography of Marx informs us about certain aspects of the work. Of course, not about the details of value theory. This you have to read Capital. But for example, the sources, when Marx came to study so intensively value theory, this was not clear from the beginning, and it was not such an important theme, for example, for Adam Smith or David Ricardo. But when you then know from the biography that there was a dispute with Proudhon about money abolishing money but keeping commodity production? Is this already socialism? Marx in Grundrisse started to discuss money questions, then comes to value. So by the biography, you can learn why and when certain issues became important and other issues disappeared. And I think we need this context. Or to give another example, a very famous example, the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers did only interpret the world, but the task is to change the world. I just give my own quick translation now. I didn't check it, but you understand. This sentence and also the thesis on Feuerbach are quoted again and again for every opportunity. But when you look to the life of Marx, then you will realize that Marx never published these theses, and you cannot find a second statement like this 11th thesis. So when all this is so enormously important, as many readers believe, then we have a problem. Because obviously Marx didn't find this so important that he published, or he not even tried to publish this thesis. For me, this is a reason to go back to the time where Marx wrote, for example, the thesis on Feuerbach, to check the context, to check the conflicts in Marx's head with his formerly young Hegelian friends, and then the thesis look in a different light. For example, For example, philosophers means not at all philosophers in general. It means the criticized young Hegelian philosophers. So we have to put these theses in the time where they emerged, and for this time we must pay attention to the conflicts Marx had. Only then we can come to a better understanding. And so there are many examples like this. Therefore, the biography I'm working on is not just a collection of anecdotes that you know something of the private life of Marx. If this would be the only aim, I wouldn't spend so much time on it. I think it is important to understand better why, when, and how Marx worked. So I think this will have an influence to the interpretation, and of course the interpretation then also will have an influence to the translation of these texts. But until now, this is mainly a promise. If I can keep this promise, you have to wait until I finished this biography, and unfortunately this will last some time.
Well, we're waiting, Michael, with hope and excitement. If I could just add one thing to this, I kind of touched on the point earlier, but maybe it's worth restating in case it didn't come through very clearly. We're talking about translation and interpretation, and I was trying to suggest that while translation obviously involves interpretation, it involves a certain kind of interpretation, not the sort of interpretation that you engage in, again, when you're most of the time, that you engage in when you're making some big, bold reading of a text. And when I'm translating, not trying to get inside the author's head exactly, but it is important for me to have a sense of what mattered to the author. I feel a certain responsibility to the text that I don't feel when I'm just trying to give a reading of the text. I have, there are responsibilities there. I'm trying to be a conscientious scholar, but I'm much more willing to push things, stretch things, as you do in that context. And so it is very helpful then to have the kind of information that Michael was just talking about. What mattered to Marx? Did this statement really matter to him in the long run? Was it of abiding, enduring significance? And some of what has guided my decisions about where to put my best energy, what to prioritize in translating, because with a text this large, you can't prioritize anything, is this sense of what mattered to Marx in Capital, first and foremost, that I have gained drawing on scholarship like Michael's and other scholarly resources that have only come about since the fall of the Berlin Wall. In other words, that came into being long after Ben Fowlkes's translation was published.
Okay, are there any further questions or comments from this group? I want to share with you in the chat a discount code for Princeton University Press that Paul and Paul have shared with us. I hope it's still valid, Paul. PUP30 is, and I'm putting it in the chat right now. So that's if you order online from Princeton, direct from Princeton, the volume, and that gives what, a 30% discount? Is that right?
Yes, I think so. And I apologize about the price of the book. We pushed Princeton to go with a lower price, but we lost. They control the means of production. And anyway, there will be a paperback edition, so that I'm hoping will be actually less expensive than the Penguin version. So,
is there a publication date yet for the paper?
Not like an official one, but we are hoping that it'll be in the fall, about a year after the hardback appeared, which is, I guess, what's customary. So late September 2025.
Good. It'll be in time for our 2026 reading of Capital Volume 1 at the Marxist Education Project. So
great.
Stay aware, everyone. Okay, thanks so much to Paul and Michael and to all of you for joining us. Keep an eye on our website, www.marxedproject.org, and we will be seeing more of you in the future. We do have a new study group on Capital Volume 3 that just began this week. It's not by any means too late to join us. And we will be running a highlights of Volume 1 with Lisa Nauer starting in late January, more than likely. Okay, thanks again. Good afternoon.